My daughter-in-law grabbed the microphone at my son's wedding reception and announced to 300 guests that I should sign my house over to them before the end of the month. What she didn't know was that I'd already made a phone call 2 hours earlier, and the man on the other end of that line was sitting in the third row, watching everything. Let me back up. My name is not important. What matters is that I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years as a commercial contractor in northern Ohio, and I built my house with my own hands, not metaphorically. I mean, I drew the plans, I poured the foundation with 2 buddies, and a rented mixer. I framed every wall. My wife, Sandra, painted every room before she passed 8 years ago. The house is not just property. It has her handprints on the dining room wall where she pressed her palms into the yellow paint as a joke, and we never covered it up. I used to walk past that wall every morning and say good morning to her like an old fool. My son, my only child, was 31 when he met her. I'll call her my daughter-in-law because that's what she became, and I'm still trying to figure out how. Her name was Christelle, Kristel. She made a point of spelling it out the first time we met, like the unusual spelling was a credential. She was 34, taught spin classes at a gym in Columbus, and she had a way of speaking that made everything sound like a correction. Not loud, just precise in a way that made you feel like you'd said the wrong thing, even when you hadn't opened your mouth yet. My son, I'll call him my son, because that's what he is. He's a good man. He's quiet, thoughtful, a civil engineer who builds drainage systems for municipalities. He's the kind of man who reads the instructions before assembling furniture and actually follows them. He called me the night he met her, which was something he never did with other women, and I could hear it in his voice. That particular kind of gone. She's different, Dad, he said. Different how? She sees things clearly. She doesn't mess around. I said that sounded nice. I meant it at the time. I met her 6 weeks later over dinner at a restaurant she'd chosen. It was the kind of place where the menu had no prices on the version they hand to guests, which I've always found to be a theatrical form of rudeness. She ordered for both of them without asking him first. He smiled when she did it, like it was charming. I watched his face while she spoke to the waiter, and something in my chest went quiet in a way that wasn't comfortable. She was pleasant to me that night, engaged, even. Asked questions about the house, about what kind of contractor work I'd done, about the square footage, normal questions, or questions that seemed normal. I've thought about that dinner many times since, and I think she was doing math the whole evening. I think I was a line item. They got engaged 14 months later. My son called me from the driveway of her apartment complex because he said he wanted me to be the first to know. He sounded happy in a way that was real, not performed. And so I was happy too, even though something in the back of my mind had been keeping a quiet list for over a year. The list had things on it like the time she interrupted him at Thanksgiving to say his story about a job site flood was not really that interesting. The time she told me my kitchen was charming in a tone that meant the opposite. The time I heard her on the phone in my hallway, speaking in a low, fast voice, and she came around the corner and the call ended instantly, and she smiled at me with all her teeth. The time my son mentioned offhand that she'd started managing their finances, all of their finances, including his personal savings account, which she'd asked to be added to just to keep things organized. I kept the list in my head. I didn't write it down. I told myself I was being a protective father, which can tip into something unfair if you let it. I tried to be fair. 4 months before the wedding, my son came to see me alone on a Sunday afternoon. He walked through the house the way he used to when he was a teenager, touching the door frames, running his hand along the kitchen counter. He sat down at the table where he'd eaten 10,000 meals and said, "Crystal thinks it might make sense for you to think about your estate planning." I set down my coffee cup. "Is that so?" "She's not wrong, Dad. You're not getting younger. I'm 62. "I know. Your father is 62 years old, and you're sitting in my kitchen talking to me about estate planning." He looked uncomfortable. He should have looked uncomfortable. "She just thinks the house is a big asset, and if something happened to you, probate can take a long time, and—" "Your mother's handprints are on that dining room wall," I said. He went quiet. "I'm not moving. I'm not selling. And I'm not signing anything over to anyone while I'm standing upright." I said it without raising my voice. "Are we clear? Dad, are we clear?" He nodded. He left an hour later, and we didn't speak about it again. But she didn't drop it. She just moved the conversation to a different room. The wedding was in May, at a venue outside of Columbus. Old barn renovated into an event space, exposed beams, string lights, the whole production. 300 guests, which struck me as a lot for two people who'd been together less than 2 years. My son looked handsome in his suit. He looked happy. I told myself to hold on to that. The ceremony was beautiful, I'll give her that. She'd planned everything meticulously. The flowers were extraordinary. I sat in the front row and watched my son watch her walk down the aisle, and I thought about Sandra, and I cried a little, which I'm not ashamed of. The reception was when things came apart. We were maybe 90 minutes in. Dinner had been served, the first round of toasts had finished. The band was setting up. I was talking to my cousin Fergal, one of the few family members who'd made the drive from out of state, when I noticed a shift in the room. The kind of shift where conversations stop in ripples, like when someone drops something loud and the silence spreads outward. Christelle was at the microphone. She'd taken it from the band leader, who stood behind her looking uncertain. My son was at the head table, and his expression told me this was not planned. She tapped the mic, smiled at the room with the full force of her confidence, and said she wanted to take a moment to talk about family. She said family was the most important thing. She said she was so grateful for everyone who'd come to celebrate with them. And then she said, and I am reconstructing this as accurately as I can, because I've replayed it many times. She said that she and her husband, she called him her husband, and paused to let the room react warmly, had been thinking a lot about their future, about building a life, about what that life would look like in the coming years. And we're so lucky, she said, to have family who can be a part of that. Family who have assets that they're not really using to their full potential. The room was quiet in a way that was confused rather than attentive. I think it's time for our family to think seriously about how we share what we have, she said. And I think a house that's sitting mostly empty while a young family is trying to build something real. That's a conversation worth having openly. She looked directly at me when she said it. 300 people turned to follow her gaze. We'd love for my father-in-law to consider what it might look like to pass the family home along to the next generation. The home his son grew up in. The home that should be where his grandchildren grow up someday. Silence. My cousin Fergal put his hand on my arm. I don't know if he did it to steady me or himself. I stood up. I didn't plan to. My legs just decided. That's enough, I said. I wasn't loud. The room was so quiet I didn't need to be. Christelle tilted the microphone toward me with a smile. Would you like to say something? I said, that's enough. Her smile didn't waver, but her eyes changed. There's a specific expression that people wear when they've miscalculated and they're trying to decide whether to commit or retreat. She committed. It's a fair conversation, she said. We're family. Families talk about these things. They don't do it in front of 300 people at a wedding reception. Maybe they should. I looked at my son. He was on his feet now, moving toward her from the head table, his face a complicated map of things I couldn't read fast enough. I looked at Christelle, who was holding the microphone like a weapon she'd forgotten she was holding. Sit down, she said to me, quietly, meant only for me. Something in me went still and cold the way it only does once or twice in a life. I didn't sit down. I walked to the edge of the room, pushed through the side door, and stepped out into the parking lot. I need to tell you something, and this is the part that matters. 4 months before the wedding, about 2 weeks after that Sunday afternoon conversation in my kitchen, I'd started to feel like I was standing on ground that was slowly being rearranged beneath me. I'm a contractor. I know what bad foundation feels like. So I called an old friend of mine named Darwick. We'd worked together for 20 years. He'd left construction and gone into private investigation about a decade back. Good at it. Patient, thorough, the kind of man who finds things not because he forces them out, but because he simply waits long enough for them to appear. I told Darwick I wasn't sure what I was looking for. I said I had a feeling, and I knew that wasn't much to go on. He told me feelings were actually quite a lot to go on, in his experience, and that he'd take a look. He called me 3 weeks before the wedding. He'd found some things. Christelle had been in a relationship for 4 years with a man named Percival Oakes. Perk, people called him, who owned a chain of fitness equipment distributors in the Midwest. She'd been with him when she met my son. The relationship with Perk had overlapped with the beginning of her relationship with my son by approximately 11 months. Perk had purchased an apartment in her name during that time. She'd continued to have keys to that apartment as recently as 14 months ago. There was more. The apartment hadn't been the only transaction. Darwick had found financial records that were publicly accessible through small claims filings. Christelle had been involved in a dispute with a former landlord that revealed, through the documents filed, that she'd had a co-signer on a lease who was not my son and was not Perk, but a third man who had also, when Darwick pulled the thread, contributed to a joint investment account that she'd listed as her asset in a separate civil case. I'm not a lawyer, and Darwick told me not to try to read the legal implications. What he was telling me, in plain English, was that there appeared to be a pattern of attaching to people with assets, extracting what could be extracted, and moving on. My son was the newest attachment, and my house apparently was the target. I sat with this for 3 weeks. Every day I picked up my phone to call my son, and every day I put it down, because I knew what would happen. He was in love. He was already planning a wedding. He would not hear me. He would hear instead that his father disapproved of his wife, that his father was trying to destroy his happiness, and that would be the story, and it would become the wall between us. I know my son. I know how he loves. He loves the same way his mother did, total, committed, blinding. So I decided to wait. Darwick and I talked about what waiting meant. He said he could be present at the wedding if I wanted. I said I might want that. He said he could also make a call to Percival Oakes and find out whether Perk was still in the picture, still in contact with Christelle, still anything. I said do it. He called me the morning of the wedding. Perk had been in contact with Christelle 3 days ago. Darwick had confirmed it through phone records that Perk had voluntarily shared. Because Perk, it turned out, was also tired. Tired of being strung along. Tired of being one financial thread in a complicated tapestry. Perk was willing to come to the wedding. I called Darwick from the parking lot of the venue, and I said, now. I stood in the parking lot for about 20 minutes, breathing the May air, listening to the faint sound of the band starting up inside. My phone buzzed. Darwick, we're here. I went back inside. Christelle was at the bar with a glass of champagne and a group of her friends. My son was nowhere I could see. The microphone incident had been absorbed into the evening the way these things get absorbed. People were talking again, music was playing, the open bar was doing what open bars do at weddings. I found my seat and I waited. Darwick came in through the main entrance about 5 minutes later, with Percival Oakes beside him. Perk was tall, heavy-set, with the particular kind of tired on his face that comes from carrying something too long. Darwick caught my eye. I nodded. Perk walked directly to the bar. I watched Christelle's face from across the room. I watched the moment she saw him. She didn't drop her glass. She didn't scream. What she did was go completely, entirely still. The way a person goes still when every option they have is running through their mind at full speed, and none of them are good. The champagne glass stopped halfway to her mouth. Her friends kept talking. She stopped hearing them. Perk said something to her. I couldn't hear it. She said something back. He shook his head. He put a folded envelope on the bar next to her hand and walked away. She looked at the envelope. She didn't pick it up for a long time. My son appeared from somewhere behind me and sat down next to me. He'd clearly been told that Perk was here or had seen it himself, because his face was doing something complicated. Who is that man, Dad? His name is Percival Oakes. How do you know him? I don't, but your wife does. Quite well. He was quiet for a moment. What's going on? I think we should have a conversation, I said. I think we should have it tonight, and I think it's going to be hard. And I want you to know, before anything else, I love you. I have always been on your side. That's why I did this. He looked at me. His face was the same face he'd had at 11 years old, when he was trying to understand something that didn't make sense yet. Patient. Waiting. I told him everything. He didn't yell. He didn't leave. He sat with his elbows on the table and listened to his father describe a 3-week investigation into the woman he'd just married 3 hours ago, and he listened the way you listen when some part of you already knew and couldn't admit it. When I finished, we sat in silence for a while. The apartment, he said. Yes, Perk's name was on the lease. Yes, while we were already together. For about 11 months, by Darwick's account. He exhaled. It was a long, slow exhale that seemed to come from somewhere very deep. The envelope was still on the bar. Christelle had picked it up eventually. We both saw her do it, and then she'd gone to the restroom and hadn't come back. Her friends were looking around with the careful social alertness of people who sensed something was wrong but weren't sure what. The band was playing. The wedding continued around us like a river around 2 rocks. The ring, my son said. What about it? It was your mother's ring. I should never have. She asked me to get it appraised, and I. He stopped. I hadn't known about the ring. Sandra's engagement ring, a simple gold band with a quarter-carat diamond that had been on her finger for 27 years. I'd given it to my son when he told me he was planning to propose, because he'd asked, because Sandra would have wanted him to have it. She told you to get it appraised. She said she just wanted to know. For insurance purposes. I didn't say anything. He looked at his hands. What happened next was not dramatic in the movie sense. There was no confrontation in the middle of the reception, no public scene beyond what had already happened. Christelle came back from the restroom 20 minutes later, with her composure fully reassembled. She sat down with her bridesmaids. My son walked over to her, and they spoke very quietly for a long time, and whatever she said and whatever he said, that was between them. It wasn't mine. The wedding wound down. Guests left. The venue staff began collecting centerpieces. I helped my cousin Fergal find his coat. My son called me the next morning from the hotel. He told me he wasn't going on the honeymoon. He told me they'd had a long, hard conversation, and that there were things Crystal had said that she couldn't explain away, and that the envelope Perk had left at the bar contained printed records of wire transfers and phone communications that she also couldn't explain away. He said, I should have listened to that thing in my gut. You're listening now, I said. I feel like an idiot. You fell in love. That's not idiotic. What you do next, that's what matters. He came home that week. Not to my house. To his apartment, which was his alone. She'd been staying there, but it was his lease. He spoke to an attorney. The marriage was short enough and the financial entanglement minimal enough that the process, while not easy, was navigable. The ring came back. I don't know exactly how that conversation went, but it came back, and I have it now in the small wooden box in my dresser where it's always been, next to the watch my father gave me. My son moved into a rental house about 20 minutes from me in the fall. He comes for dinner on Sundays. He's quieter than he used to be, which I think is different from sad. It's the particular quiet of someone who has learned something about themselves and is still integrating it. I recognize that quiet. I went through it after Sandra died. Last spring he started seeing someone. He called me from his car to tell me, same as the first time. His voice had that same particular quality. But this time he also said, I want you to meet her before it gets serious. I want to know what you think. Yeah? I said. Yeah. I said I would love that. We went to breakfast on a Saturday morning. My son, this woman, and me. She was a kindergarten teacher from a town 30 miles east, straightforward and funny, the kind of person who tells the truth at slightly unnecessary moments because she's forgotten to calculate whether it's useful. My son looked at her the way he'd looked at Sandra's ring when he first held it, like it was something real and possibly his. She asked about the house. I told her I'd built it myself. Do you still live there? She said. 31 years, I said. And you built it. Every wall, she said. That must be something. Not a valuation, not a calculation, just what it was. I drove home that afternoon and walked through every room the way I do sometimes. The dining room, the kitchen, the back porch Sandra loved because she could see the maple tree from it. The handprints on the dining room wall, the quiet weight of a house that knows you. I stood at the window and watched the light change in the maple tree, and I thought about how the things that matter most are almost never the things that can be appraised. My son texted me that night. It said, Thanks for today, Dad. She liked you. I texted back, I know, I liked her too. I set my phone down and made myself a cup of coffee and sat at the table where my son has eaten 10,000 meals, and I thought about the morning of the wedding, standing in that parking lot, dialing Darwick's number, knowing I might be wrong, knowing I might blow up my son's happiest day for nothing, knowing I might be exactly the kind of father who can't let his child go. And I thought about what Sandra would have said. She would have said, You're not trying to hold on. You're trying to make sure there's something worth holding on to. She was usually right about things like that.